Blood always leaves a stain, but secrets bleed out in entirely different ways. When a terrified, overweight housemaid tried to pour a simple glass of red wine with a bone shattered in her forearm, she thought her silence would keep her alive. She didn't realize the man sitting at the head of the table saw every wince, every drop of cold sweat. By the time the sun rose over the New York skyline, 10 brutal men had vanished off the face of the earth, and a ruthless syndicate boss had started an underground war for her. Sweat pooled at the nape of Charlotte Higgins's neck, soaking into the stiff white collar of her uniform. She was a heavy woman, round and soft, carrying the kind of weight that made her the invisible punchline in the cruel, bustling kitchens of the De Agostino estate. Usually, her size was her shield, rendering her entirely unnoticed by the elite, dangerous men who walked the halls of the upstate New York mansion. Tonight, however, the extra weight felt like a heavy anchor dragging her straight into hell. Every step she took across the imported marble floor sent a blinding, white-hot shockwave of agony up her left arm. Just 3 hours earlier, in the damp alleyway behind her cramped Queens apartment, 10 men had cornered her. They were low-level enforcers for a neighborhood loan shark named Mickey Sullivan. Charlotte's deceased father had owed $40,000, a debt that had been violently transferred to her upon his sudden death. She had begged for another week, but Mickey's boys weren't there to negotiate. One of them, a towering brute named Frankie Cole, had swung a metal baseball bat with sickening force. Charlotte had thrown up her arm to protect her face. The sound of her radius bone snapping had echoed like a gunshot off the brick walls. They left her gasping in the garbage, promising that next time it would be her skull. Now she was expected to serve dinner to Vincent D'Agostino. Vincent was a man who ruled his empire with cold, calculated precision. He was the head of the most feared syndicate on the East Coast, a man who could spot a lie in the twitch of an eyelid. He sat at the head of the long mahogany dining table, surrounded by his underbosses, discussing shipping routes and union payoffs in hushed, dangerous tones. Charlotte stood by the swinging kitchen doors, her breathing shallow and erratic. She had bound her forearm tightly with an ace bandage and a torn bedsheet underneath the long, suffocating sleeves of her black uniform. Her arm was swollen to twice its normal size, throbbing with a heartbeat of its own. The fabric was tight against her fat, aching flesh, and the restriction was making her lightheaded. "Charlotte, stop dawdling," hissed Rosa, the head housekeeper, giving her a sharp shove between the shoulder blades. "Take the Barolo to Mr. D'Agostino, and don't you dare spill it." Charlotte swallowed the bile rising in her throat, gripping the heavy crystal decanter with her good right hand. But it wasn't enough. The decanter was massive, meant to be supported by a second hand beneath its base. She stepped out of the shadows and moved toward the dining table, her orthopedic shoes squeaking faintly against the floor. Her heavy thighs brushed together with each step, a usual friction she ignored. But tonight, every vibration rattled the broken bone. She approached Vincent's right side. He was deep in conversation with a lieutenant named Gregory, his dark eyes narrowed in thought. Charlotte reached out. She forced her left hand to rise, trembling violently as her swollen fingers brushed the bottom of the decanter to support the weight. The moment the heavy crystal settled onto her broken forearm, a wave of nausea so profound washed over her that her vision went entirely black for a fraction of a second. A tiny stifled whimper escaped her lips, a sound no louder than a mouse. But in the sudden lull of conversation, It was deafening. Vincent stopped speaking. He didn't look at the decanter. He didn't look at the wine. His piercing gaze snapped directly to Charlotte's face. She was ashen. Her usually ruddy, round cheeks were completely drained of color, making the dark circles under her eyes look like bruises. Sweat was beading on her forehead, and her bottom lip was caught between her teeth, bitten so hard a bead of blood was forming. "I apologize, sir," she whispered, her voice cracking as she hastily tipped the wine into his glass, pulling her left arm away and tucking it securely against her wide waist. Vincent didn't touch his glass. He watched her. His eyes, the color of wet slate, tracked the awkward, stiff angle at which she held her left side. He noted the way her uniform sleeve stretched taut over a bulge that hadn't been there yesterday. He noticed the way she leaned heavily to her right, compensating for a deep, localized agony. "Are you unwell, Charlotte?" Vincent's voice was smooth, a low baritone that commanded absolute silence in the room. The underbosses stopped talking. All eyes turned to the fat, trembling maid. "No, Mr. D'Agostino. I am perfectly fine. I just lost my footing for a moment," she stammered, bowing her head so her chin pressed into her chest, desperate to hide her face. Vincent's gaze hardened. He didn't suffer liars, not even the ones trying to be brave. "Leave the decanter. Go to my private study and wait for me." Charlotte's heart stopped. Being sent to the study was never a good thing. It was where people were interrogated, where people were fired, or worse, where they were handed over to the basement crew. "Yes, sir," she choked out, setting the crystal down with her right hand and turning as quickly as her aching body would allow. As she retreated, Vincent turned his head slightly toward his right-hand man, Richard. "Find out who worked the front gates today," Vincent murmured softly, his eyes never leaving Charlotte's retreating, heavy figure. "Someone let her walk in here trying to hide an injury, and call Dr. Harris. Tell him to bring the portable X-ray to the study." The private study was a cavernous room lined with leather-bound books and smelling faintly of cigar smoke and aged bourbon. Charlotte stood awkwardly near the heavy oak desk, too terrified to sit in one of the plush armchairs. Her arm felt as though it was on fire, the swelling now cutting off circulation to her fingers, which had turned a terrifying shade of blue. The heavy mahogany door clicked open. Vincent stepped inside, locking it quietly behind him. He didn't go to his desk. He walked directly toward her, his imposing frame casting a long shadow under the warm glow of the lamps. "Sit," he commanded, pointing to a leather sofa. Charlotte obeyed, her heavy frame sinking into the cushions. She clutched her left arm to her chest, her breathing jagged. "Roll up your sleeve," Vincent said, his voice stripped of its earlier conversational tone. It was a direct, absolute order. "Please, Mr. D'Agostino, it's just a sprain. I can work." "Charlotte." He stepped closer, towering over her. "Do not lie to me in my own house. Roll up the sleeve." With trembling, clumsy fingers, she fumbled with the buttons at her wrist. She couldn't undo them. The pain was too intense, and her right hand was shaking too badly. Without a word, Vincent knelt on the rug in front of her. The sight of the ruthless crime boss kneeling before a lowly, overweight maid made Charlotte's breath catch in her throat. His large, scarred hands gently brushed hers aside. With surprising dexterity, he undid the buttons and slowly, painstakingly, rolled the fabric up past her elbow. When the makeshift bandage was revealed, stained with a mix of sweat and slight bruising, he pulled a switchblade from his inner pocket. Charlotte flinched violently, pressing herself back into the sofa. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said softly, sliding the blade under the tight fabric and slicing it away in one fluid motion. The cloth fell away. Even Vincent, a man who had seen decades of gruesome violence, went completely still. Charlotte's forearm was deformed. It bowed outward at an unnatural angle, swollen to the size of a melon, mottled with horrific shades of black, purple, and sickly yellow. The skin was tight and shiny, ready to split. "Who did this?" Vincent asked. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. His eyes were no longer just observant. They were filled with a terrifying, cold rage. "I fell," Charlotte wept, the tears finally breaking through. "I fell down the stairs at my apartment complex. A fall doesn't snap a bone in this specific transverse fracture, Charlotte. That is a defensive wound. You raised your arm to block a strike from a blunt weapon." He looked up at her face, his gaze burning through her defenses. "You are under my roof. You are my staff. That means you are under my protection. I will ask you one more time. Who broke your arm?" The dam broke. Sobs tore through Charlotte's chest, her heavy shoulders heaving as she confessed everything. She told him about her father's gambling addiction, the debt, Mickey Sullivan, and the 10 men who had cornered her in the alley. She named Frankie Cole as the one swinging the bat. She spoke of their threats to return, her voice pathetic and small in the grand room. Vincent didn't interrupt. He listened. His jaw locked so tightly a muscle ticked near his temple. When she finished, Dr. Aris knocked on the door and entered with his medical bags. "Set the bone. Cast it. Give her whatever she needs for the pain," Vincent ordered the doctor, standing up and brushing off the knees of his trousers. He looked down at Charlotte, his expression unreadable. "You will sleep in the guest suite on the East Wing tonight. You are not going back to Queens." "But my job, your only job right now is to heal," Vincent said quietly. He walked out of the study and down the long hallway toward his command center. He pulled his encrypted phone from his pocket and hit a single speed dial button. "Richard," Vincent said, his voice echoing in the empty hall like the tolling of a funeral bell. "I need you to pull the boys together. We have a pest problem in Queens." "Who's the target, boss?" Richard asked. "Mickey Sullivan and his entire collection crew. Specifically, a heavy hitter named Frankie Cole." Vincent stopped in front of a grand window, looking out over the moonlit grounds of his estate. "I want all 10 of the men who run Mickey's alleyway collections." "You want them brought in for a talk?" "No," Vincent said softly. "I don't want them talking ever again. I don't want them found. By sunrise, I want it to be as if they never existed. Do you understand? Consider it done." That night, while Charlotte slept deeply under the haze of strong painkillers in a king-sized bed, wrapped in silk sheets, the underbelly of Queens was ripped apart. Black SUVs rolled into the neighborhood without headlights. Doors were kicked in. Suppressed gunshots whispered in the dark. Men who had laughed while shattering a terrified woman's arm were dragged screaming from their beds, thrown into the trunks of cars and driven out to the marshlands, never to return. By the time the morning sun filtered through the grand windows of the D'Agostino estate, Charlotte woke up with a heavy plaster cast on her arm and a strange sense of peace. She turned on the small television in the corner of the room. The local news anchor looked bewildered as she reported a bizarre, mass disappearance of 10 known gang affiliates in Queens overnight. No bodies, no witnesses, just empty apartments and a sudden, chilling silence on the streets. The door to the suite opened softly. Vincent stood in the doorway, holding a tray with tea and toast. He looked at the television, then down at Charlotte, a faint, dangerous smile touching his lips. "Drink your tea, Charlotte," he murmured. "The streets are much safer today." Charlotte stared at the high-definition television screen, the steaming cup of Earl Grey tea trembling in her good right hand. The NY1 morning anchor was standing on a bustling street corner in Astoria, Queens, right outside the grimy local pub where Mickey Sullivan usually held court. The headline banner flashing across the bottom of the screen read, "Mass Disappearance, NYPD, baffled by missing local men." There were no bodies. There was no blood left behind in the narrow alleys or the cheap walk-up apartments. 10 men, including the hulking nightmare that was Frankie Cole, had simply evaporated into the New York night. Vincent D'Agostino remained standing in the doorway of the guest suite, the morning light catching the silver threads at his temples. He was dressed impeccably in a charcoal Brioni suit, his presence commanding and entirely out of place next to a domestic maid. Yet he watched her with an unreadable intensity. "They won't come back, Charlotte," Vincent said, his voice a low, soothing rumble that sent an involuntary shiver down her heavy spine. "You never have to look over your shoulder in Queens again." Charlotte swallowed hard, setting the porcelain teacup down on the mahogany nightstand before she dropped it. She looked down at her thick waist, her broad thighs, hidden beneath the luxurious high thread count duvet. She was acutely aware of how much space she took up in this pristine bed. In her mind, she was just the fat, clumsy girl who scrubbed baseboards and absorbed insults without complaint. The idea that a man like Vincent, a multimillionaire with absolute, terrifying power, would orchestrate a bloodbath on her behalf was entirely incomprehensible. "Mr. D'Agostino," she began, her voice quivering. "The police, if they trace this back to you. I could never live with myself if you went to prison because of my father's stupid debts." Vincent chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. He stepped fully into the room, crossing the plush Persian rug to sit on the edge of the mattress. The bed dipped under his solid weight. "The NYPD's 114th precinct is not going to trace a single thing to me, little bird. The men who vanished were bottom feeders, extortionists. The city is breathing a collective sigh of relief. And as for your father's debt, Mickey Sullivan no longer holds your paper." Before Charlotte could process the magnitude of his words, a sharp knock echoed from the open doorway. Richard, Vincent's stoic right-hand man, stood in the hall, his face carved from granite. "Boss," Richard said, his tone clipped. "We have a situation. We need you in the city, now." Vincent's jaw tightened. He stood up slowly, the brief moment of warmth vanishing, replaced instantly by the cold, calculating aura of a syndicate boss. "Stay in this room, Charlotte. Dr. Aris will be by to check your cast at noon. Rosa will bring you lunch. Do not lift a finger." Within 20 minutes, Vincent was seated in the back of a jet-black Cadillac Escalade, speeding down the Henry Hudson Parkway toward Manhattan. Richard sat across from him, swiping through a secure, encrypted tablet. "The cleanup in Queens was flawless," Richard reported, keeping his voice strictly professional. "The vehicles were crushed in the Newark junkyard, and the cargo is permanently resting at the bottom of the deep water trench off the coast of Montauk. Frankie Cole and his 9 associates are ghosted." "Then what is the problem, Richard?" Vincent asked, pouring himself a measure of bourbon from the vehicle's hidden console. "The problem is Mickey Sullivan," Richard replied, sliding the tablet across the console. Mickey panicked when his muscle disappeared. He didn't go to the police. He went to his backers. Turns out, Mickey hasn't been operating independently. He's been kicking up his extortion money to the O'Connor syndicate over in Hell's Kitchen. Tommy O'Connor is furious. He views the eradication of Mickey's crew as a direct territorial attack by the De Agostino family. Vincent took a slow sip of his bourbon, the fiery liquid burning down his throat. The O'Connor syndicate was a ruthless faction of the Irish mob. Tommy O'Connor was a notoriously volatile man, prone to starting bloody street wars over perceived slights. Vincent had deliberately kept a fragile truce with the Irish for nearly a decade, focusing his own empire on legitimate real estate fronts, high-end casinos, and international shipping. Tommy O'Connor is a rabid dog, Vincent mused, staring out the tinted windows at the passing city skyline. If he wants to bark, let him. But double the security detail at the upstate estate. No one gets through those iron gates without my explicit clearance. Back at the sprawling mansion, Charlotte was struggling to adapt to her new reality. By 1 o'clock, Rosa, the severe head housekeeper who had pushed her just the night before, entered the suite carrying a silver tray laden with roasted chicken, steamed vegetables, and a slice of rich chocolate cake. Rosa's demeanor had violently shifted. The sharp, critical glares were gone, replaced by a nervous, almost fearful deference. She set the tray down with trembling hands. "Is there anything else you require, Miss Charlotte?" Rosa asked, her eyes darting to the heavy plaster cast on Charlotte's left arm. "Rosa, please, it's just me," Charlotte pleaded, feeling a deep flush of embarrassment heat her round cheeks. "You don't have to call me Miss, and you certainly don't have to serve me. I'm staff." "You are a guest of Mr. De Agostino," Rosa corrected swiftly, taking a step back towards the door. "My explicit instructions are to ensure your absolute comfort. Eat your lunch, Miss Charlotte. I will return for the tray in an hour." When the door clicked shut, Charlotte looked at the decadent food. Her stomach growled, but anxiety twisted her intestines into knots. She dragged her heavy legs out of the bed, ignoring the tray, and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling mirror in the corner of the room. She stared at her reflection. She saw a wide, thick waist, heavy hips, and a doubled chin that she desperately tried to hide by tilting her head down. She was wearing a borrowed silk nightgown that clung to every roll and curve of her large body. She felt like an imposter, a fat, broken maid trespassing in a king's castle. She touched the hard plaster of her cast, the dull, throbbing pain, a stark reminder of the brutal world she had just been dragged into. "Why is he doing this?" she thought, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Men like Vincent D'Agostino do not start wars for girls like me." But as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the immaculate lawns of the estate, the gears of the underworld were already turning, and the bloody consequences of her broken arm were hurtling toward them all. The tension inside the D'Agostino estate was palpable, thick enough to choke on. 2 days had passed since the mass disappearance in Queens, and the perimeter of the upstate mansion was now swarming with armed guards. Men in dark suits and tactical gear patrolled the gardens with suppressed rifles, their eyes constantly scanning the tree line. Vincent had not returned to the estate since he left for the city. Charlotte was going stir-crazy in the guest suite. Her arm ached fiercely, a deep, bone-deep throb that the painkillers only dulled into a manageable hum. She missed the mindless rhythm of scrubbing floors and polishing silver. The idleness was giving her far too much time to dwell on the impending danger she had brought to this house. On the third morning, The heavy oak door of her suite swung open, revealing Vincent. He looked exhausted. The sharp lines of his face were drawn tight with fatigue, and his tie was loosened, the top button of his dress shirt undone. Yet the moment his dark, slate eyes landed on Charlotte, the harshness in his expression fractured, softening into something dangerously close to affection. Following closely behind him was a diminutive, sharp-featured woman carrying 3 massive garment bags, accompanied by 2 of Vincent's bodyguards, hauling a rolling clothing rack. "Mr. D'Agostino," Charlotte gasped, instinctively pulling the heavy duvet up to her chin to hide her body. "Vincent," he corrected smoothly, walking into the room and gesturing for the woman to set up the rack. "Charlotte, this is Madame Geneviève. She is the finest private clothier in Manhattan. She is here to take your measurements and construct a wardrobe suitable for your stay." Charlotte's eyes widened in horror. "A wardrobe? Sir." "Vincent, no. I can't. I don't need silk dress or tailored clothes. My uniform is perfectly fine, and besides, designers like her don't make clothes for women my size. I'll just stretch out the fabrics and look ridiculous." The self-deprecation tumbled out of her mouth before she could stop it, fueled by years of department store dressing room humiliations and cruel comments from strangers. Vincent stopped moving. He turned to face her, his expression instantly hardening, but not with anger directed at her. It was a fierce, protective fury. He waved his hand dismissively at Geneviève and the guards. "Wait in the hall. Close the door." The room emptied in seconds, the heavy door clicking shut. Vincent walked slowly to the edge of the bed. He reached out, his large, calloused fingers gently prying Charlotte's tight grip off the duvet. He pulled the blanket down, forcing her to sit exposed in the simple cotton nightgown. "Listen to me very carefully, Charlotte," Vincent said, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating with intense sincerity. "I have spent my entire life surrounded by hollow people, thin, starving women who wear expensive clothes to cover up empty souls. You have more warmth, more substance, and more genuine beauty in your little finger than any woman who has ever walked through my front doors." Charlotte's breath hitched. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "You think your weight is a flaw," Vincent continued, his thumb gently brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "I see a woman who has carried the heavy burdens of the world on her shoulders and survived. You are not going to hide in oversized polyester uniforms anymore. You are going to wear fabrics that respect you. Do you understand?" Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over her thick lashes. No man had ever spoken to her like this. No man had ever looked at her substantial body and seen anything other than a joke or a burden. She gave a small, jerky nod. "Good," Vincent murmured, his thumb catching her tear. He stepped back, his professional mask sliding flawlessly back into place. "Geneviève!" For the next 2 hours, Charlotte endured the bizarre luxury of being measured, draped, and pinned in some of the most exquisite fabrics she had ever touched. Geneviève, strictly adhering to Vincent's lethal glare, was nothing but complimentary, designing empire waist gowns, tailored slacks, and cashmere cardigans specifically meant to flatter Charlotte's wide hips and full bust. While the fitting took place in the bedroom, Vincent sat in the adjoining private sitting room, staring at his encrypted phone. The silence was abruptly shattered by an incoming call from Richard. "Speak," Vincent ordered, pressing the phone to his ear. "Boss, we have a breach of sorts." Richard's voice was tight, strung with anxiety. "Not at the estate, at the corporate office in Midtown. Detective James Miller from the 114th Precinct just walked into the lobby with a federal warrant for our shipping manifests. Vincent's blood ran cold. The NYPD didn't get federal warrants for missing street-level thugs overnight. This was heavily coordinated. Who pushed the warrant through? A judge sitting in the pocket of the O'Connor syndicate, Richard confirmed. Tommy O'Connor isn't just threatening a street war. He's using his political leverage to open up our books. Furthermore, Detective Miller explicitly asked the receptionist if we had a female employee matching Charlotte's exact physical description. Vincent stood up, knocking his heavy leather chair backward. It crashed onto the hardwood floor with a deafening thud. Charlotte gasped from the next room, poking her head through the doorway, her good arm clutching a swath of emerald green silk to her chest. "Everything all right?" she asked, her voice trembling. Vincent forced his face to remain impassive. He looked at her, seeing the vulnerability in her wide eyes, the cast on her arm, a glaring reminder of the violence that was rapidly closing in on them. "Everything is perfectly fine, mia cara," Vincent lied smoothly, slipping into his native Italian endearment without realizing it. He hung up the phone. The situation had just escalated from a neighborhood vendetta to a full-blown syndicate war. Tommy O'Connor had connected the dots. He knew Mickey Sullivan's men had broken the arm of a Maid, and he knew that Maid was now being sheltered by the head of the D'Agostino family. Charlotte was no longer just a rescued bystander. She was the catalyst for the destruction of a multi-million-dollar criminal truce. Vincent walked to the large bay window, looking down at the heavy iron gates of his driveway. A black, unmarked sedan was idling suspiciously at the end of the road. They had found her. The Viper was rattling its tail, and Vincent knew that to keep the heavy, beautiful woman in the next room alive, he was going to have to burn Hell's Kitchen to the ground. Rain began to fall in heavy grey sheets against the reinforced glass of the master suite windows, blurring the perimeter lights of the estate into smeared halos. Vincent D'Agostino stood utterly motionless, his slate-colored eyes locked onto the unmarked sedan, idling beyond his iron gates. He watched as a tinted passenger window rolled down just an inch, a tiny red laser dot flickering out from the darkness inside the car, dancing briefly across the stone pillar of the gatehouse. "Get down!" Vincent roared, spinning on his heel. He lunged across the bedroom, tackling Charlotte just as the muffled thwip, thwip, thwip of suppressed automatic weapon fire shattered the tranquility of the afternoon. Heavy, armor-piercing rounds chewed through the thick bay windows, sending cascades of broken glass and shredded emerald silk raining down around them. Charlotte screamed, a raw, terrifying sound of pure panic, as Vincent's massive weight bore her down into the plush carpeting. He shielded her completely, tucking her heavy, trembling body beneath his own, mindful to keep his weight off her plastered left arm. The deafening roar of return fire erupted from the grounds below as Vincent's tactical guards opened up on the sedan, their unsuppressed rifles echoing like thunderclaps over the hills. "Stay perfectly still," Vincent ordered, his mouth pressed against the shell of her ear. His breathing was dangerously calm, a stark contrast to the violent trembling racking Charlotte's soft frame. Outside, tires screeched in a frantic, desperate wail. The heavy crash of metal on metal resounded as one of the estate's armored SUVs rammed the fleeing sedan, pinning it against a thick oak tree down the winding driveway. The gunfire ceased abruptly, replaced by the harsh, commanding shouts of Richard and the security team securing the targets. Vincent slowly pushed himself up on his forearms, looking down at Charlotte. She was hyperventilating, her wide, tear-filled eyes locked onto his. Her face was pale, devoid of the warm flush that usually colored her round cheeks, and her uninjured hand was fisted so tightly in the fabric of his ruined dress shirt that her knuckles were white. "Are you hit?" he demanded, his hands quickly moving over her shoulders, her waist, and her thick thighs, checking for blood. "Charlotte, look at me. Are you bleeding?" "No," she choked out, a ragged sob tearing through her throat. "No, I'm okay. Vincent, they came for me. Because of me, they are trying to kill you. They are trying to kill me because Tommy O'Connor is a desperate, dying animal who thinks he can intimidate a predator," Vincent corrected coldly. He stood up, offering his hand to help her off the floor. Despite her size, he pulled her up effortlessly, his grip firm and steady. "You are not a burden, Charlotte. You are the line in the sand I have been waiting to draw." Before she could process his words, the bedroom door burst open. Richard stood in the doorway, and an assault rifle slung across his chest, his suit jacket discarded. "Boss, perimeter is secure," Richard reported, his chest heaving slightly. "2 shooters in the car, both dead on impact when we rammed them. They had O'Connor ink on their necks. It was a targeted hit. They weren't trying to breach, they were trying to send a message by shooting up the master suite." "They missed," Vincent said, his voice dropping into a register of lethal, icy calm that made Richard stand up a little straighter. "Take Charlotte to the underground bunker. Lock the titanium doors and post 4 men on the hatch. No one goes in or out without my verbal authorization over the closed-circuit comms." Charlotte's heart plummeted. "The bunker? Vincent, no, please don't leave me down there in the dark. I can't." She hated how needy and pathetic she sounded. A fat, terrified maid, clinging to a billionaire crime boss. But the thought of being locked in a subterranean room while bullets flew above made her stomach turn violently. Vincent stepped into her personal space, completely ignoring his right-hand man standing in the doorway. He reached out, taking her soft, wide face between his rough, scarred palms. His thumbs gently traced the high arcs of her cheekbones. "I will not leave you in the dark, my sweet girl," Vincent whispered fiercely, the intimacy of the moment stripping away the hardened boss and leaving only a man fiercely protective of what belonged to him. "But I have to go to war, and I cannot fight if I am worried a stray bullet will find you. You are my greatest weakness now, Charlotte. I need you safe so I can be ruthless." He leaned down and pressed his lips firmly against her forehead, a lingering, possessive kiss that sent a jolt of heat straight to her core. It was the first time he had shown such blatant affection, and it left her utterly breathless. "Go with Richard," Vincent commanded softly, stepping back. Without waiting for her reply, Vincent turned and marched down the hallway, dialing his encrypted phone. The time for defensive posturing was over. It was time to rip the heart out of Hell's Kitchen. Down in the bunker, the silence was suffocating. Charlotte sat on a cot, surrounded by concrete walls and shelves stocked with emergency rations and medical supplies. Her cast throbbed viciously, the adrenaline of the ambush fading and leaving only a deep, agonizing ache in its wake. She pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her good arm around her thick legs, feeling entirely out of place in this violent world. She was a woman who baked pies and scrubbed floors. Now, men were bleeding and dying because she had been clumsy enough to get her arm broken by a loan shark's thugs. Hours bled into one another. The digital clock on the wall blinked agonizingly slow. Charlotte paced the small confines of the bunker, her heavy footfalls echoing off the concrete. She worried about Vincent. The realization hit with the force of a physical blow. She cared for this dangerous, lethal man. He had seen past her size, past her status, and treated her with a reverence she had never experienced in her 30 years of life. Above ground, the war was already raging. Blood painted the docks of the Hudson River that evening. Vincent's retaliation was not a surgical strike. It was a devastating, overwhelming wave of violence designed to cripple the O'Connor syndicate in a single night. Dozens of D'Agostino enforcers, heavily armed and operating with terrifying efficiency, hit 3 of Tommy O'Connor's illegal casinos simultaneously. They didn't take money. They took lives. They burned the gambling halls to the ground and sent the surviving Irish capos running for the safety of their heavily fortified headquarters in Hell's Kitchen. Back at the upstate estate, the grand dining room had been transformed into a war room. Blueprints, city maps, and surveillance photos were strewn across the long mahogany table where Charlotte had spilled the wine just days ago. 6 of Vincent's most trusted lieutenants sat in high-backed chairs, their faces grim, smoking cigars and drinking black coffee. Vincent stood at the head of the table, his suit jacket discarded, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and faded tattoos. Tommy has pulled all his remaining muscle back to his nightclub on 10th Avenue, Richard explained, pointing a heavy finger at a satellite image of a massive brick building. He's dug in. The place is a fortress. Steel-reinforced doors, bulletproof glass, and at least 40 armed men inside. A frontal assault will be a bloodbath on our side, boss. Vincent stared at the map, his mind working through a dozen tactical scenarios. He thinks he can wait us out. He expects us to besiege him. We can't starve him out, a lieutenant named Salvatore grunted. The NYPD is already sniffing around. If we leave 40 armed men barricaded in Midtown Manhattan, the feds will raid both our families by the weekend. Then we draw him out, Vincent said softly. The heavy oak doors of the dining room creaked open, silencing the room. The men reached for the weapons holstered under their jackets, but Vincent raised a hand, stopping them instantly. Charlotte stood in the doorway. She had convinced the guards to let her out of the bunker, arguing that the immediate threat had passed and she needed fresh air. She was wearing a simple, elegant, black dress that Madame Genevieve had rapidly tailored for her. The fabric draped beautifully over her ample curves, cinching perfectly at her waist. She looked dignified, beautiful, and completely terrified as 6 hardened killers stared at her. "Charlotte," Vincent said, a warning edge to his voice. "This is not a place for you right now." "I know," she said, her voice shaking slightly. But she forced herself to step fully into the room. She was tired of hiding in the dark. She was tired of feeling like a helpless, fat burden while men died for her. "But I overheard the guards talking. You're trying to figure out how to get Tommy O'Connor out of his club," Richard scoffed softly. "With all due respect, Miss Charlotte, this is cartel business. You shouldn't be listening to—" "Quiet, Richard," Vincent snapped, his eyes never leaving Charlotte. "Speak, my girl. What is on your mind?" Charlotte swallowed hard, her good hand nervously smoothing the fabric over her wide hip. "My father. Before he died, he used to do plumbing work for some of those old clubs in Hell's Kitchen. I used to help him carry his tools when I was a teenager. That specific building on 10th Avenue, the one Tommy owns, it used to be a meat-packing facility in the 20s. The lieutenants exchanged confused glances, but Vincent stepped closer to her, his complete attention captured. "Go on." There is a massive, antiquated ammonia cooling system beneath that building, Charlotte explained, her confidence growing slightly under Vincent's encouraging gaze. The pipes run directly underneath the main dance floor and into the city's old steam tunnels. My dad always said it was a death trap. If someone were to access the steam tunnels from the adjacent subway grate and crack the main pressure valve, the entire building would fill with toxic ammonia gas within 3 minutes. The ventilation system wouldn't be able to handle it. Silence descended over the war room, thick and heavy. Salvatore let out a low whistle, a grin spreading across his scarred face. Gas them out. They can either choke to death in their fortress, or they can run out the front doors directly into our crosshairs. Richard looked at Charlotte, the previous skepticism completely wiped from his face, replaced by a deep, grudging respect. You just handed us the keys to the castle, Miss Charlotte. Vincent did not smile. He walked up to Charlotte, his large frame dwarfing her. Yet she didn't shrink back this time. She stood her ground, her heavy chin held high. You realize what you are suggesting, Vincent murmured, for her ears only. You are giving me the blueprint to slaughter 40 men. They broke my arm, Vincent, Charlotte replied, her voice dropping into a cold, hardened tone she didn't know she possessed. She looked down at her heavy plaster cast, then back up into his slate eyes. And they tried to kill you. I am done being a victim. A slow, dangerous smile finally curved Vincent's lips. He reached out, his hand cupping the back of her neck, his thumb tracing the soft skin there. You are magnificent, he whispered. He turned back to his men, his demeanor instantly shifting back to the ruthless warlord. Load up the trucks, Vincent commanded, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. Get breathing apparatuses for the tunnel team. We hit the club at exactly 3 a.m. By sunrise, the O'Connor Syndicate will be nothing but a memory, and Hell's Kitchen will belong to us. Midnight rain lashed against the cracked asphalt of 10th Avenue, washing the grime of Hell's Kitchen into the overflowing gutters. Across the street from Tommy O'Connor's heavily fortified nightclub, Vincent D'Agostino stood in the pitch-black shadows of an abandoned storefront. I was flanked by Salvatore, Richard, and a dozen men armed with suppressed tactical rifles. They were silent, lethal wraiths waiting for the signal. Beneath the city streets, a 3-man team clad in heavy hazmat suits and industrial respirators navigated the decaying, rat-infested steam tunnels. Guided by the precise hand-drawn map Charlotte had sketched onto a napkin just hours earlier, they located the rusted access grate, situated directly beneath the club's main dance floor. At exactly 3:04 a.m., Richard's radio clicked twice in his ear. Main pressure valve located. Cracking it now. A distorted voice whispered over the encrypted frequency. A deep, subterranean groan vibrated through the soles of Vincent's leather shoes. It was followed by a faint, high-pitched hiss that grew steadily louder, echoing up through the sidewalk grates. Within 60 seconds, the heavy steel doors of the nightclub, which had stood as an impenetrable barrier all evening, began to rattle. Inside the fortress, chaos erupted. The archaic cooling pipes had ruptured violently under the sudden manual pressure shift, vomiting massive clouds of concentrated ammonia gas directly into the club's ventilation shafts. The toxic vapor was invisible but devastating, searing the lungs, blinding the eyes, and suffocating the oxygen out of the air in a matter of seconds. Vincent raised his hand, 2 fingers extended. The safety clicks of a dozen rifles echoed in the rainy alleyway. The heavy steel doors of the nightclub burst open, violently kicking outward. A flood of men poured into the rainy street, coughing up blood, their hands clawing frantically at their burning eyes and throats. They were completely blinded, dropping their weapons as they stumbled over the curbs, desperate to breathe the cool, rain-slicked air. Vincent dropped his hand. The ensuing crossfire was brutally efficient. It was not a battle, it was an extermination. The suppressed weapons coughed quietly in the darkness, dropping the suffocating, blinded enforcers before they could even draw their sidearms. Bodies piled on the wet pavement, the rain washing the blood into the storm drains in thick, dark ribbons. Vincent did not fire his weapon. His cold slate eyes scanned the panicked crowd, searching for the head of the snake. He knew Tommy O'Connor wouldn't run out the front door with his foot soldiers. Tommy was a rat, and rats always had a back exit. "Salvatore, hold the perimeter. Richard, with me," Vincent commanded, stepping out of the shadows and striding purposefully toward the narrow, garbage-strewn alleyway bordering the rear of the club. As they rounded the corner, a heavy iron service door slammed open. Tommy O'Connor stumbled out, a soaked handkerchief pressed over his nose and mouth, a gold-plated revolver clutched in his trembling right hand. He was hacking violently, his face purple from oxygen deprivation. Waiting for him in the idling getaway car was none other than Judge Harrison Caldwell, a notoriously corrupt New York Supreme Court judge who had signed the fake warrants earlier that week. Tommy froze as Vincent stepped into the center of the alley, blocking his path. Richard immediately leveled his rifle at the judge in the driver's seat, freezing the terrified official in place. "D'Agostino," Tommy wheezed, spitting a glob of bloody phlegm onto the wet bricks. "You think you can wipe me out? You think Caldwell here won't have the feds crawl all over your shipping ports by morning?" Vincent walked forward slowly, the rain matting his dark hair to his forehead. "Judge Caldwell is going to take a very long, permanent vacation to the Cayman Islands tonight, Tommy. And you aren't going anywhere at all." Tommy raised the gold revolver, desperation contorting his face. But before he could pull the hammer back, Vincent drew his own sidearm with terrifying speed and fired a single, deafening shot. The bullet struck Tommy squarely in the chest, folding the Irish mob boss backward into a stack of wooden pallets. He slid to the ground, dead before his body settled into the puddles. Vincent holstered his weapon, adjusting his cuffs with chilling nonchalance. He looked at the trembling judge in the car. "Richard, make sure his honor catches his flight. I am going home." By the time Vincent's Escalade rolled back through the heavy iron gates of his upstate estate, the eastern horizon was bleeding a pale, bruised purple. The war was over. The D'Agostino Syndicate was now the undisputed, terrifying power of the East Coast. Yet, as Vincent walked through the grand foyer, shrugging off his wet, ruined suit jacket, his mind was entirely occupied by the woman waiting upstairs. He found Charlotte in the master suite, standing by the massive bay windows that had been temporarily boarded up. She was still wearing the elegant black silk dress. The soft glow of a solitary bedside lamp cast warm light across her broad shoulders, illuminating the soft, generous curves of her hips and the thick, comforting weight of her thighs. She turned as he entered, her wide eyes instantly scanning him for injuries. "You're covered in blood," she whispered, taking a hesitant step forward, her heavy cast clutched against her chest. "It belongs to other men," Vincent replied, his voice exhausted, stripped of all its commanding authority. He walked toward her, dropping his shoulder holster onto a velvet chair. He didn't stop until he was standing inches away from her. The adrenaline of the slaughter was fading, leaving a hollow ache in his chest that only she could fill. He reached out, his large hands resting on the wide flare of her waist. For a woman who had spent her entire life trying to shrink, trying to take up less space, Vincent's grip was an anchor, entirely reverent and completely grounded in her substantial form. "It's over," Vincent murmured, leaning down to press his forehead against hers. "Mickey Sullivan, Tommy O'Connor, they are gone. No one will ever raise a hand to you again, Charlotte. Not while there is breath in my lungs." Tears spilled over her thick lashes. She let out a shuddering breath, her good hand reaching up to touch his stubble-roughened jaw. "You burned down half the city for a maid." "I burned down half the city for my queen," Vincent corrected fiercely, his fingers digging slightly into the soft, yielding flesh of her hips, pulling her heavy body flush against his hard, muscular frame. "There is no maid in this room. There is only the woman whose brilliant mind just saved my life, and the woman who owns every beat of my black heart." Charlotte looked into his slate eyes, finally allowing the heavy burden of her insecurities to fall away. She was fat. She was scarred. She had a broken arm. But standing in the arms of the most dangerous man in New York, she finally realized she was absolutely, terrifyingly beautiful. Vincent leaned down, capturing her lips in a deep, consuming kiss. It tasted of rain, danger, and an unbreakable devotion. The sun crested over the New York skyline, illuminating a city that had been violently rearranged, entirely oblivious to the fact that a quiet, overweight girl with a broken arm had just rewritten the rules of the underworld. What an explosive finale! Charlotte started as an invisible maid, hiding a broken arm. But she proved that true strength doesn't come from your size. It comes from your mind, your resilience, and the courage to claim your worth. Vincent tore down an entire criminal empire just to keep her safe, proving that when a real king finds his queen, absolutely nothing will stand in his way. Did Charlotte's brilliant trap leave you cheering? If you loved this thrilling, unconventional Mafia romance, hit that like button, share this story with a fellow romance lover, and subscribe to our channel. Leave a comment below. What was your favorite moment of Vincent protecting Charlotte? See you in the next story.